Welcome back. You may recall that last time we engaged in a sketch of each of the founding denominations and organizations that were part of the United Church of Canada eventually. We talked a little bit about their history in this country, which was moving at the same time from being a colony to being a dominion still within the British Empire. We talked about the challenges of moving from the context of Britain to the context of British North America and all of what that meant and how various groups adapted and did not adapt to the changing circumstances. So let's draw all that together and talk about what we can say in general about Anglo Saxon Protestantism in Canada at the turn of the 20th century. As these folks moved from the 1800s into the 1900s, what can we say about them and what did they have in common and what distinguished them? Regardless of their denominational traditions, the various groups shared several characteristics. We must start by recognizing that they were Victorians, with all that that means. They were classist, racist, and sexist to their very marrow. They were convinced of the superiority of the English speaking world, whether we're talking about the British Empire or the growing and rapidly expanding American influence. And they would say that they would feel that way with some justification. For example, in the last decade of the 1800s, there were some incredible things that took place, almost without exception throughout the British Empire, which in fact did stretch all around the world and also in the United States. There were bumper crops of every sort of growing thing. There were significant advancements in science and technology. The 1896 World Exposition in Chicago was just a stunning example and showcase of things that were making life entirely different. For example, electricity and the widespread availability of electricity and what that meant for the preservation of food and for providing light in the darkness and so on in homes and in towns. They would talk about how the British Empire, well, the sun never really set on the British Empire. It was true. There was always, the British Empire was so large that there was always some part of it that was in the daylight. And so they would say that they were justified in their pride and in their attitudes towards other people. We don't have to disagree with them, but it's within that sort of reality that we can try and comprehend the Canadian Anglo Saxon Protestants. And remember that as the 1800s closed, the new Dominion of Canada was still a relatively young nation. So, what can we say about these Anglo Saxon Protestants in Canada? Well, they tended to use an amalgam of British and American practices, which sort of revealed their background. The fact that, as we saw last week, the expressions of Methodism or Presbyterianism or Congregationalism in this country tended to arise from those dual streams. So, for instance, they would use American evangelistic techniques which were coupled with a more British reserve and a somewhat less individualistic approach to the reality of salvation. For the most part, they tended to be upwardly mobile, both socially and economically. And that often put them at a disadvantage with immigrants from rural areas who were often put off by the more elaborate buildings and the more refined worship and the more highly trained clergy, and as a result, gravitated towards the simpler holiness or Salvation Army styles of worship. This was also true in the growing cities, which weighed very heavily on the spiritual conscience of Anglo Saxon Protestants. For the most part, they were fairly stable theologically. They were not given to the extreme reactions that characterized sister denominations in the United States. For example, Canadian Protestants accepted a rather modest view of biblical criticism. They usually focused on the linguistic analysis of biblical texts in the original languages. Very few Canadian Protestants were caught up in the more aggressive so called higher criticism which was emerging from Germany. Higher criticism focused on the historical realities of the text, and they called into question their veracity and reliability as historical documents. There were a few ugly scenes with some advocates of higher criticism in Canada, but for the most part, ways were found to accommodate both groups within the same denominational families. Mainline evangelicalism, and remember how we defined evangelical last week. Mainline evangelicalism included a commitment to scientific progress. In other words, the strongest evangelical had no difficulty with scientific method and was convinced that science, rightly practiced and understood, would affirm the truths of Scripture. So, along with the British, they tended to believe in Christianized evolution, which is to say that the theories of Darwin and his successors were consistent with the idea of a divine creator and therefore proved rather than undermined the Christian view of the world and creation. They were optimistic about the world and their place in it. They were open to innovation both liturgically and theologically. They were committed to personal liberty balanced by order, stability and tradition within a fairly rigid social hierarchy. They were cautiously receptive to non Protestant immigrants to the country, and most of the immigration at this point was now coming from Southern Europe, which tended to be Roman Catholic in nature, and from Eastern Europe, which tended to be Orthodox in background. And they accepted those immigrants with some degree of cautious receptivity, concerned about some of their morals. And so, for the most part, we can say that Anglo Saxon Protestant, English speaking Protestants in Canada at the turn of the 20th century were united in traditional practices of doctrine and piety, trying to respond to a shared context which caused them to question some of the old ways of doing things and being. They were dealing with rapidly changing circumstances as the population exploded and ways of living altered. And they were particularly concerned about the rapidly expanding West, into which millions of non Anglo Saxon and often non Protestant immigrants were pouring. If you look at the statistics, the first decades of the 20th century continued the pattern of the last decade of the 19th century. In other words, much of the land, much of the attractive land in the United States had already been taken up. And so Canada became the focus for large numbers of European immigrants. And we're talking millions upon millions in a still relatively small population, including numbers of Lutherans, Greek Orthodox, and Ukrainian Catholics, which were a new experience for most Anglo Saxon Protestants. And they were concerned with the cities of the East, which were struggling to deal with industrialization and the growth of slums. Slum living and the growth of slums connected to industrialization and large numbers of people doing terribly repetitive work at painfully low wages, with the consequent impacts on social and educational and economic life. This was all new. It was new to Canada, something of which many religious groups in England were becoming aware. And so, how do you respond to that? How do you do ministry in those groups? How do you respond? Remembering, of course, that in those days the role of government was much smaller, and much of the social amelioration, social welfare work, social service work, if it was going to happen at all, was going to take place because of the churches. To our Anglo Saxon Protestant Canadians, being good Protestant Canadians and being good Christians, they were assumed to be parallel realities. So you were a good Protestant Christian, and that meant being a good Canadian. But that didn't translate into wide ecumenical tolerance. They really wondered about either the Christianity or the Canadian nature of some of the immigrants with which they dealt. They were willing to offer a general welcome for strangers in a strange land and a commitment to take the Gospels to those whom they imagined lacked it. That included Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians. Their desire was to convert and Canadianize immigrants at the same time, which meant, along with Protestant Christianity, instilling a commitment to British institutions and Victorian moral standards. One of the places where they found some degree of collaboration was in the social gospel movement, which we will turn to next week. And in the first decades of the 20th century, we see a cracking of that consensus. Anglo-Saxon Protestants had a shocked reaction to immigrant disregard for Sabbath keeping and for temperance. The immigrants who were coming into Canada lacked the traditions of the Sabbath as a day of solemn remembrance of worship, certainly not work, and they certainly had a different relationship to alcohol than the Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the country. Given the nature of life and the challenges of life in the new country, churches were often drawn into more institutional work like schools, hospitals, and clinics, and less of the traditional pastoral work and worship services among the newcomers. All denominations were involved in founding community centers, and what were called all people's missions were started by all denominations. And these were, in effect, community buildings housing worship and prayer groups and Sunday school, day schools, clinics, employment bureaus, hospitals in some cases, and so on. In the swelling cities, the adult Bible class was in its heyday, and arenas would be filled with students. Think of your typical hockey arena and imagine it filled with adult students for a Bible class. And those were a, a thing in those days. Now, the poor represented a heavy weight on Christian consciences. And that led to special programs and services such as the Fred Victor Mission, which was started by Methodists in Toronto in 1894. Canadian churches of all denominations tended to be more involved with the poor than their American counterparts, partly because they still held the loyalty of slum dwellers. So for example, Presbyterians coming out of the slums of Liverpool to the slums of Toronto still maintained their loyalty to the church, and the same thing was true of Methodists. So for a time, anyway, those more traditional denominations held the loyalty of the slum dwellers and could continue to have a place and a role to work with them. There were also unique alliances of liberal and conservative theologies around preaching, around educational techniques, around pushing for legislative responsibilities to prostitution, gambling, alcoholism, and the Lord's Day. And that sometimes created odd alliances with the Roman Catholic hierarchy and the fledgling labor movement. The picture I'd like to leave you with is of churches trying to find ways to respond to what were unprecedented social situations, dealing with large numbers of folks who had traditions and ways of being that they had never encountered before. Doing this within an image of social life which was particularly framed in Victorian terms. And so seeking different ways of responding faithfully to the place in which the Spirit called them to be. And we'll turn next week to look at one of those responses that begins before the founding of the United Church and continues afterwards, and specifically the social gospel movement. Thanks very much. We'll see you in class.